Hello, thank you for visiting this channel. As you all know, and for new subscribers, this video channel is for people who play chess leisurely, people who are, just trying to basically improve on their chess without any um, desires of being a professional player someday. This is just for, the average Joe who just likes the game and open to, little by little improve their play without any pressure. I am not a title player. I am an amateur like yourself, and my purpose is to just share the thought process of another amateur trying to learn and enjoy the game at leisure. So, without ado, let us start this game, which is filled with so much strategical play, emphasis on tempo, space, um, close positions, piece placements, and things like that. The game starts with White, who is my opponent, playing the Queen Pawn opening. And one of the things that I aim to do in this channel is to not rush through the moves like you might find in other channels that are hosted by experts in the game, or club players or other GMs. They move. I find out that they move at a very fast rate that a lot of amateurs like myself get lost sometimes. And so, to not replicate that, my purpose is to try to explain what's going on, per move, such that the new person who is just trying to learn how to get around chess understands what they should be thinking about, what they should be doing. I will not be talking about openings because personally, like I said, I'm an amateur like yourself. I don't know so much openings, but I do know the principles of the opening part of the game, which I will also be emphasizing. So bear with me, I will try to explain things that I think might be beneficial to newcomers to the game. One of the reasons why I don't think opening theory is not beneficial to newcomers is that you really cannot predict what your opponent is going to play. You don't have an opponent that plays a specific opening such that you have tried to do some practice or some preparations using the computer to play against them. So ideally, the best thing to do is at a beginner level, which I am also, maybe a little bit higher than a raw beginner, but I'm a clear amateur, is to just focus on the opening principles. And the opening principle is that you try to move your center pawns out such that um, your pieces can actually find a way out and you can actually develop towards the center. Um, and once you're able to do that, you can then castle. That should be your main focus in the beginning of the game. So my opponent does that by opening up. I replied with an equally good move. Um, one of this move, when you hear that you should try to control the center with your pawns, this is what that means. You're pretty much laying claim to these squares such that your opponent is not able to place any of their pieces in these squares without being captured. And another thing you're doing is that you're preventing the forward advance of this pawn such that the This pawn advancing forward does not interfere with the development of your own piece. So that's pretty much the basic idea at our level of what you should be looking out for. My opponent plays a rook move. Um, Personally, I would advise my fellow amateurs not to play such moves in the beginning of the game. Reason is that it wastes time. Time is a very important factor when you're playing chess because it allows you to get ahead in attack, which is another word for tempo. You get to dictate the game, and your opponent just gets to defend or follow. But when you make a move that is not forcing, that is not improving your position, it gives that power to your opponent, which is what I believe White did at this point. Um, some other experts or theoretical um, players might argue that my opponent probably did that so that at some points they could develop their bishop to the f4 square and then hide that bishop in the h2 square. But at this point, as beginners like myself, I would advise against that. It just gives the power back to your opponent. You should try to avoid that. And because white has given the power back to me, I'm able to immediately counterattack in the center in a form of a queen's gambit reversed, with black playing the queen's gambit this time around. My opponent accepts my gambit, and I immediately moved my pawn in order to recapture. While this pawn move blocks my light squared bishop, I made it because I'm hoping that if white tries to defend this pawn, this is a trick in the queen's gambit accepted opening, I can try to undermine that pawn with this move. And if white decides to follow up with another protection, I can then capture the pawn, and when white captures back, I can have a direct attack on white's rook. If I had developed my pawn to this square, that direct attack would have been obstructed by the pawn on the e5 square. So that's why I made this move. My opponent rightfully develops the knight, and I reclaimed my pawn. My opponent, noticing that my bishop was eyeing the f2 square, which is probably the most vulnerable point right now in white's position, my opponent rightfully intercepts that attack with a helping move that gives white's bishop the opportunity to be developed. These are the things you need to be thinking about as an amateur when you're playing chess. I developed also and getting ready to castle. My opponent also develops. At this point, I figured that my light squared bishop is going to be hemmed in by this pawn, making my light squared bishops um, a bad bishop. So I figured the best thing I could do is to exchange off this bishop as early as I can for white's well-placed bishop with a clear diagonal. I anticipated that there would be a castling, and if I could get my bishop to this square, then I can attack this bishop, force an exchange because the bishop would be pinned against the rook on the square. So I made a move of this pawn to allow for my plan to exchange the bishop. My opponent rightfully castles. I went ahead with my plan. My opponent exchanges their good bishop for my bad bishop, and they made the next move. Now I have an issue with this move because it doesn't do anything good. As a matter of fact, it may have hampered White's development of their knight to a potentially good square. I haven't done that. My plan is to continue with my development and also reroute my knight from this side of the board where you can't really feel the full strength of the piece. That is why, as amateurs, we're being told to not develop our pieces to squares where their maximum strength cannot be felt. We should develop them towards the center where you can where they can exercise their maximum strength. You will see that at the side of the board, at the rim, this knight only attacks 4 squares, while this knight attacks more than 4 squares when they are towards the center. So my next plan is very simple. Reroute this knight to a better square, castle, and finish my development. So I castled. My opponent makes this premature knight jump. While it might look like they're trying to come to this square and attack my queen, you realize that this threat does not really do much because this is just one piece attacking an entire army. The other pieces that white have, they are still sitting on the back rank. As an amateur, this is something that we should all try to avoid. Try not to be hasty. Try not to try to suppress the urge to want to quickly start an attack. A lone attack like this is usually bound to fail or not be successful, and more so, it wastes time. Remember, time is very important in this game that you should have used to improve on your pieces. This is an opportunity that white has because my plan is to take some time to repurpose or place my knights in a better square. The time that I would use in doing that should be the time that white is using to develop their undefended pieces, but white is not taking advantage of that, and that allows me to place my bishop in a better diagonal, this diagonal, while at the same time attacking white's undefended knight. White moves away, so this is why you shouldn't be doing that because um, black is the only one who has benefited from those moves. White has wasted time going to e5 and going all the way back to f3, while at the end of it all, black has been able to put their bishop in an open line, a fantastic diagonal. One of the strategies of the game is piece placement. You need to look at squares where you would place your pieces if you in open lines. If you are working with bishops, rooks, the queen, you want to put them on a square where they have access to open lines of attack. And for your knights, you want to place them in outpost squares. Outpost squares are squares where your knight cannot be driven away by the opponent's pawn. and they are supported by your own pawn. So those are the things you want to be focusing on when you're playing the game of chess. A lot of times as beginners and amateurs, we're like, oh, I don't know what to do. I'm lost. What should I be doing now? These are the things you should be thinking about. Which squares can I place my pieces so that they can exert their maximum strength on the position. So as mentioned, I started working on putting my knight on a better square, and my opponent makes another pawn move, which does not necessarily help my opponent's position. Um, my opponents still have undeveloped pieces on their back ranks. This is the only piece that has been developed so far. While I have developed two pieces, this the knight here was previously developed, but then undeveloped and will soon be developed. My opponent should have used that time in also developing their own piece, but then they make another pawn move that is not really helpful to their position. So I moved my queen to form more or less like a battery on this diagonal, and at the same time eyeing the backward pawn that for a good part of the game it was a battle to win this backward pawn. My opponent defends the backward pawn the second time and also develops their bishop. But the problem is that this bishop is now a really bad bishop. The bishop is behind their pawns, and this is also as a result of the pawn moves that white made, placing their pawns on the same color as their bishop. You should not be doing this because what happens is that they obstruct your bishop. Notice how my own bishop has a very clear and diagonal towards the enemy king, while white's bishop is being obstructed by their own pawn. To to prevent this situation on black side, that was why I made the early exchange of my own light squared bishop that could have ended up the way um, white's bishop is right now. So that is part of the strategic play. You want to think ahead. You want to look at your best pieces. You want to trade off your bad ones with your opponent's best pieces. So I continued my goal of repurposing my knights towards to a better square. As you notice, I talked about outposts in the position. This looks like a really juicy outpost for my knights. At this point, my bishop is doing well, my queen is doing well. I need to just put my knights in better squares and possibly my rooks also on better squares. So these are the things you need to be thinking about in strategic play as an amateur of the game. My opponent develops their knight towards the rim of the board. Um, Not really the best. A better move would have been to develop at least towards the center. My opponent is hoping to come to this square and, you know, force an exchange of the bishop. And if should I blunder, maybe take my queen for free or exchange my queen for their knight. This was very obvious, and I played a prophylactic move to prevent the knight from coming to this square because now I control the square. So as an amateur, these are the things you should be thinking about. Think about your opponent's plan when they make their own move and try to shut it down. Try to see if you can counterattack it and try to see if you can go ahead with your own plans. My opponent had to go back, um, wasted another tempo in jumping to that square and going all the way back to that square. Then I improved my knight's position. This is a two-purpose move. One is that I'm hoping that if my opponent decides to capture, I can capture back and now have two attacks on this backward pawn. And if possible, a third attacker, and a fourth attacker on this backward pawn. That was the purpose of that move. The second purpose of the move was to come to that juicy outpost and have that knight that was initially on this square now go to an excellent square. My opponent refused the offer for exchange. They also tried to centralize their knight. If I were my opponent at this point, I would rather have played this knight to this square instead of the knight here, such that even if this exchange goes on, you can recapture back. Or another thing that my opponent could have done is to have exchanged, and when I recapture, they can then play their knight to seal off my attack on that backward pawn. But they didn't play that way. They played this way, and then I continued my plan to pile up on this backward pawn. My opponent decides to encourage my knight to go to the desired destination anyways, and mission accomplished. My knight is now on the desired square and also with tempo attacking the undefended bishop. My opponent sees that, takes care of that situation, and also prevents any forward knight move that my knight might be planning. I took the opportunity to jump to the second outpost. My knights are now well placed for the battle ahead. My opponent at this point is cramped. This is where space also matters. I'm controlling the center. Um, my pieces are well placed in the center. They're exerting their maximum power in white's position. This is what you want to do with your pieces. These are the things that the players that are better than us. These are the things they're always thinking about. These are the things they're always trying to do with their pieces. And you see how white is really cramped in. This bishop is totally useless, just trying to perform some defensive roles because of all these pawns on the same color as the bishop. This rook is boxed in. It's as if white really did not get a lot in development. Um, Besides that, white's knights are on the second rank. They are not exerting any, they are in a defensive position, while my knights are in an offensive position. These are the things that you want to be aiming for as a strategic player. Um, Sorry about that. We have to. So yeah, and then the next move that I made was a little bit strategic in the sense that I noticed that these squares are weak in white's position, and I was looking to see if my queen can begin to find a way into that weak area of white's king, and if my knight can potentially join in that with my bishop that is also pointing along this direction, and especially since white's pieces are kind of all cooked on this side of the board, maybe it's going to be a good idea to start attacking white's king. That's why I made that move, and my opponent decides to see if they could either open up this file and maybe have a chance of counter-attacking, or maybe to just come all the way here and add extra defense to this pawn, since they kind of see that my game plan is really attacking this backward pawn. I used that opportunity to seal any advance of white's pawn, gain more space, and also really make sure that this bishop is not getting out of this area of the board. So that's part of a strategic play also. You're looking at your opponent's piece, you want to make them weaker. The strong ones, you want to exchange them off. And you want to use the opportunity to place your own pieces at strong squares. Now, not only do I have this pawn supporting this outpost, I also have this other pawn supporting my knight on these great squares. My opponent continued with their plan, and I moved my bishop away from this square. And this is why I did that. This is a lot of things that you don't get in those expert channels. That's why I'm taking my time to explain to fellow amateurs like myself. I did that because I realized that my bishop at this point is really unable to do a lot because white's pawns, as much as they, put white's bishop in some prison, they also kind of restrict the scope of my bishop on this square. So my purpose of placing my bishop all the way back is because I'm already looking at this diagonal, because it seems that this diagonal might look like a better one than this current one. So my plan was to move my bishop to that diagonal, pin this pawn against white's king, and at the same time maybe start shifting my attack towards the also backward e-pawn in white's position. My opponent then reoccupy the d4 square again with the knight, which kind of stopped all of my plan that I had earlier on. So I decided maybe it's a better idea to just stay on this diagonal and maybe work towards opening up this diagonal such that my bishop has an open line in future. Now I played my rook to guard this pawn. The reason why I did that might not be obvious right now, but it's because I'm looking at dislodging white's pawn from the d4 square with my pawn here. If I make this move to attack white's center, I have my bishop controlling that square, and by x-ray my queen is also controlling this square. But what happens is that that pawn move makes this pawn undefended, and if I should make this pawn move prematurely, white could make a knight move attacking my queen, and when my queen gets out of the way, this queen may be able to take this undefended pawn. That is why I made the rook move to defend this pawn. My opponent gets out of the way of the rook. It is a general idea where when you see your opponent's rook facing your own queen directly, and you may not be able to figure out what's going on in the center, you want to get out of the way so that you don't have a discovered attack on your queen. Now I was thinking that maybe I can move my knight to this square, attack that backward pawn again. Now we're back to that weakness. Attack this backward pawn the second time, maybe double my rooks and have both of them attack this backward pawn. And who knows, maybe even bring my queen later on to attack the backward pawn. So that was why I made the backward knight move. because I'm hoping to come here and then attack that pawn. My opponent kind of sees ahead to some extent and decides to protect this backward pawn, which is the weakness that this game was largely about. And then I made this move. And now this move was, I've just explained the reason why I made that move. But you will also notice that this bishop move kind of finally puts a nail in the coffin of this white rook. One of the things you want to ensure in your position is that you are attacking and really not defending. You want to be attacking your opponent's pieces and position. Then why makes this move? This move I honestly do not understand, but I was glad to see this move because now it weakens this pawn. As amateurs, you need to be very careful about pawn moves when we are just starting. A lot of times we don't really pay too much attention to our pawn moves. You need to realize that each time you move a pawn that was previously on a square that was protecting these squares, the moment you move that pawn, you lose protection for those squares. Now you may be protecting new squares, but you have lost the protection of the squares that are adjacent. So to me, it sounds great. It sounds like an opportunity that I might be able to pounce on in future. So I made this move to get out of the way of, remember the analysis that I made here? So I made that move to get out of the way. And now I'm really getting ready to push my e6 pawn to f5 to e5 and then hopefully open up this diagonal for my bishop. White plays that move. I believe they were open to double up on this file. And then realizing that I really couldn't make any headway on that side. Oh, that's part of the strategic play. I'm sorry if this video is getting too long, but I feel that a lot of beginners and amateurs don't really understand this part of chess. You want to constantly improve the position of your pieces. When you see that the piece is not doing well, you want to put them in a position where they can exert a lot of force on the position. The reason is that when you put your pieces in such positions, then tactics are likely to open up for you that you can take advantage of. But if your pieces are in a very difficult square, they may not be well poised for tactical play. And then my opponent, of course, seeing that their pawn is weak, moves their king to defend the pawn. But of course, the king is not usually a great defender. Now I place my knight back to a more active square. And when I realized that the previous square I wasn't getting much, the difference with this is that now I have a possibility of an attack here that would fork these two rooks. And if I come to that square, this queen cannot capture on this square because of the second defense and also second attack that I would have on that square. So that was the plan for moving that knight back, besides putting it in a better position. So that's what I'm talking about. When you put your pieces on the right squares, then you have a chance at a tactical play that might win you the game. My opponent, seeing that, decides to add a second defense to that square. So two attackers, two defenders. This square looks safe right now. Then I proceeded with my initial plan. So remember, you will notice that while I already had this plan in my mind, I was also playing on different sides of the board, looking for the right opportunity, the right time to make my plan. So you should always be thinking of different things that you can do from different sides of the board while you're playing the game. And still don't forget that the main thing is to be able to open up this line. But while you're doing that, you're also being mindful of other strategic and tactical possibilities that you may be able to exert on the position. And all of this happens when you place your pieces in the right squares. My opponent takes, and now I my plan has been achieved. Great diagonal for my bishop, also with my queen right there, my knight pointing um, to that pawn, which is quite weak in my opinion. At this point, yes, white has quite a defense on this pawn, but as you can see, white's king, pardon me, is really getting exposed, while this rook cannot help, this bishop cannot help. At this point, the computer is even recommending that I probably make, you know, rook moves to add to the attack and things like that. My opponent went ahead. White went ahead with the plan, like I mentioned, for doubling up on this file. But I wasn't really worried about that. I took a look at the possibilities that might occur. If white takes, my plan was to go and seize this file from white, and then if the rook takes, my second rook by x-ray defending on that square takes, and now I have an attack on white's queen, and white would have to leave that diagonal for me, and then the diagonal is mine, while this other rook is just lost where it is. So, and yeah, so remember also when we talked about when you make piece moves or pawn moves, always remember that while you control new squares, you also give up defense of other squares. Now, if you're the one attacking, you can take advantage of that. But when you're defending, it's pretty hard. And that's why you always need to make sure that you are the one that has a tempo. You're the one on the attacking side. So remember while we were looking at this plan, we still had this other plan in the pockets. And finally, we got an opportunity to break through the position. This is actually the move, in my opinion, that kind of lost the game for white. So, and this is the part. This is what you see in the thumbnail in this video, and this is where all those little advantages, this piece placement, this space, that we're trying to get, and all of this is where they now actually culminate into a win for us. So I went ahead, and not only did I get this um, double attack on this rook, now I have a triple attack with an attack also on the queen. My opponent, you know, correctly captures. At least finally that bishop, gets to do something, and immediately the other knight jumps into that square, maintaining the triple attack. And white had to, make the choice to save the queen. So I went ahead and I went the exchange up. Notice that I did not capture this rook, even though I could. But the reason why you don't want to do that is that you want to capture your opponent's active pieces. This rook where it is pretty much dead. It's going to need an extra tempo to be able to get out to do anything. So you shouldn't be helping your opponent to get rid of their terrible piece. The only reason why I made this exchange that freed up the bishop was because I knew that I was going to end up an exchange of doing that. So those are the things you need to be thinking about. You should be thinking about the consequences of the moves you make. And you shouldn't be helping your opponents free up their tight piece or their weak piece. No, you should be thinking of capturing their strongest piece, um, exchanging their strongest pieces while you are avoiding the same on your side, and you're possibly putting your own pieces on stronger squares. So now you notice that this exchange has opened up another the weaknesses in white's position. Remember these 2 pawns? Now they are really up for grabs. White recaptures, and then I figured, why don't we start piling up on those weaknesses? White tries to play a counter-attacking move, which is, I'm also going to attack your own weakness. While that is, not a bad idea, but with my analysis, I figure that I'm gonna be a pawn up in that exchange, and not only would I be um, a pawn up in that exchange, I was also willing to give up this pawn because this pawn is isolated at this point. An isolated pawn is a pawn that doesn't have neighboring pawns to protect and guard them. So I was willing to give up my isolated pawn as long as I can capture white's pawn in return. So I captured a pawn, white recaptures, and I captured attacking white's pawn. Now, white is thinking that they can take my pawn as they already planned, while simultaneously attacking my rook and guarding their own pawn. But what white fails to realize is that my bishop is now alive for a check on white's king. So white went ahead, and I went ahead as planned with a check. The king moves out of the way. Notice the king did not move to this square because that would have probably caused a discovered check on the queen. So I made this prophylactic move because I noticed that white is posed for a double attack on my king and my rook. So I made that move. Um, Another better move might be to just move my king closer. And so white goes ahead to attack my rook, but I have a free pawn. Took another pawn, and white goes back to pretty much stabilize. That's what I can really say is going on here. But that gives me an opportunity to remember these diagonals, to pin the knight against the king, and the king had to move out of the pin, but then that allows me to exchange these two knights for a rook. So remember, all the tactical plays are now coming into positions because are now coming into play because of my piece placement. Remember this old white rook still stuck here, does not have time to get out because of the tempo. I've been able to seize the tempo. I'm the one creating the attacks. And while this rook is helpless because on I can remember what move that was, maybe on move 21, we're on move 40 right now. On move 20 moves ago, this rook made that mistake of staying on this square, and now while the game has already opened up, the rook is still stuck on that square. So as beginners, as amateurs like myself, we need to always think about piece placement. It's part of the strategy of the game. As explained, I made my exchange. Now I'm a bishop up, and I have three pass pawns that are gonna be potential queens. So the next strategy at this point is for me to find a means of exchanging these rooks. If I can exchange these rooks, then I'm a clear piece up and I still have my advantages of my pass pawn. So white moves back to protect against a check and a double attack on this pawn. But also remember what we talked about. When you make that move, you lose squares, even though you might gain new squares. So I took that free pawn again. And then white made this triple move, this trick, and their plan is pretty obvious, a back rank on my king. I noticed that, and I created a space, a square, an exit square. Some people call it luft or loft for my king to get out of a possible check. Notice that I didn't play this pawn because playing this pawn still falls into the trick, because what happens is that when there's a check, you you can only come here, and then white will have to come back with a double attack on my king and then win my bishop. So I opened up with this G pawn and not the F pawn. I also didn't open up with the H pawn because what happens is that I end up being far away from the center, and if white rooks go back, you can then attack this pawn, which will not be defended, and also this bishop, and I would have lost the pawn. So opening up with the G pawn allows me to still come here and still be able to get these pawns. I believe at this point that my opponent just played a, a waiting move, and I went ahead to attack this undefended pawn. Now I knew that my opponent's next move will be to defend this undefended pawn, but it was a threat that I already planned ahead, because I knew that with my opponent moving the a2 pawn to defend the b4 pawn, that would put the a2 pawn on the a3 square, which will also become undefended, and I can then go ahead and try to attack. And that happens, and that forces this rook that has been largely defensive for most part of the game to go back again to a defensive role. Now at this point in time, remember that I'd already mentioned that my plan is to exchange off the rooks. So my plan is to see that, you see how I keep coming up with plans. As amateurs, we need to keep coming up with plans. Each move that you make must have a reason. You must have a plan that you've thought about before making your move. Don't just make moves, you know, um, without any purpose or any plan. You should be making moves either to improve your pieces, either as prophylaxis to prevent your opponent from doing something, or for you executing a plan that I think will give you an advantage, or in the opening phase of the game, you're making moves to bring your pieces down, to control the center, to castle. So those are the things you should be thinking about. Those opportunities always abound in the game. When you have an understanding of the game, you know the reasons why you should be making some move and what moves you should be making. So because of that, I brought my bishop closer at in the next coming moves. But before doing that, I moved my rook to the square. Reason is that I was hoping that I could, since I have a dark squared bishop, that I could come to this square and then force an exchange on this square, because my bishop would then be protecting my rook when I put a double attack on that line, and then I can exchange that off. That was my plan. And then the king steps back. At this point in time, I believe the computer was recommending, when I was analyzing this game, to either come to this square or this square, such that you can come down with a check, and then the king cannot come to this square because it's being controlled by this bishop. The king can only come to this square, and then when you come back with your rook and with a check, you can then take this rook for free. But during the game, I didn't see that. I wasn't even thinking about that. I was just thinking about exchanging the rooks, not really winning a rook for free. I didn't even think that was possible. So I made this move so that, if the king steps up again, I can then go ahead with my plan to exchange rooks and finally, seal the game, even though the game is pretty much already won at this point. But that's a, a, a little mistake or inaccuracy on my part, because try to remember this position. This allows the king to fork those pieces. So the king now comes up and now puts a double attack on these two pieces that unfortunately cannot defend themselves. But luckily there is space for my rook to get away from the attack of the king. So I made that space, and my opponent at this point decided to see if they could, in a way, force maybe a pass pawn on this side of the board. I took a look at that, and I already concluded that if there was an exchange, I will exchange back and seal the movement of this pawn. Or worst case scenario, this move would only lock the pawns on this side of the board. I still have my own um, pass pawns that have already won me the game at this point. So I went ahead with my plan. Remember, check, exchange rooks, and white went ahead with their plan also. And then at this point, they are making their last effort to see if they could attack my undefended bishop. The computer recommends, taking this last pawn and simultaneously defending this bishop at the same time. But I was focused on my plan, which was, yes, pin the rook against the king and force an exchange. Went ahead with that, got the exchange. The king wanted to come closer. I tried to see if I could get the last pawn. The king defends. I started moving my pass pawns. The king tries to attack my bishop. I moved away. King kept on chasing, moved away. King kept on chasing, moved far away and stayed on a great diagonal. King tried to move closer. At this point, I'm not sure why my opponent has not resigned. Possibly they are looking for a possibility of a stalemate, which does happen when you play with amateurs like myself. But then I made this move to prevent, any kind of forward movement on this part, on this for this king. The king moves back. I started moving my own king closer, gain an opposition where the only option is that the king has to move back. See that my bishop is also controlling that square. King moves back. I started moving my pawns up because they control the squares. King keeps moving back. Now finally I have all these squares in control. This king cannot move to any of these squares, and including this square controlled by my bishop. So you see that I'm beginning to corner up this king at this point, and then it also gives my own king the opportunity to go all the way, capture, and then I could get a queen. And that's pretty much what happened in the game. Went ahead, got a queen, and I have mating one at this point because all of these squares are covered, and this diagonal, these two squares in this diagonal are the only options that this king has. So if you want to stop pause the video at this point to find the mate in one, you can go ahead and do that now. And if you're able to find it, it's a simple backward bishop moves that mates the king on this square. But I did not find that. But I was very careful that I understood that my opponent at this point, the reason they've not resigned is they're hoping for a stalemate. So I wanted to bring my king closer. And I noticed that my opponent keeps on moving on this diagonal. That's when I realized that, oh, I actually have a pawn, a bishop that can solve that problem. And then checkmate. At this point, my opponent lost the game. I checkmated my opponent. Thanks for watching. I know this is quite a long video, but the purpose is to be able to teach amateurs and beginners the thought process in a clear manner, not using the language of the experts or the club players or the titled players, but to be able to teach fellow amateurs like myself what another amateur is thinking about in a very simple language when they are also playing chess, and maybe they can find one or two things to learn from it. Please feel free to comment what you think about this video, and also share your own um, thinking process if you can on different aspects of the game, and let me know if you're interested in more of these videos. Thanks a lot for watching. Um, Bye.